Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of the Exercise Mechanic Podcast. Today, we're going to be talking all about dogma in the fitness industry, how to detect it, how to navigate it, where does it come from. I am joined by Ryan Taylor, the doctor of dogma. How you doing, man?
Man, I don't love that title.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. Sorry. I
Good.
try just riffing off the top of my head, and sometimes it's absolute nonsense. But that's what you get
The
with
Doctor of
live
Dogma
unedited.
sounds cool, but it's not a very flattering title.
It's not a great title. We could start recording again, but let's just roll with it. I say we roll with
I
it.
agree. That's showbiz, baby.
That's right. That's right. So we're talking about dogma today because this is, of course, we see dogma, which we'll be defining in a moment. We see it, of course, in the fitness industry. We also see it elsewhere. You know, we see it with regards to dieting. We see it in politics. We see it in religion. You see it in, I would argue, probably every industry where folks just kind of dig their heels in with regards to a specific set of beliefs and sometimes principles. And but for that reason, you know, generally speaking, if we zoom out, dogmatic thinking tends to be a little bit more on the rigid side than the flexible side. And thus, it's a little bit less adaptive and it's a little bit less conducive to learning. And which fundamentally, if we think about, you know, a really consistent predictor or reliable predictor to one's success in any domain, it's one's ability to think, ask questions, and evolve in the face of new evidence, which is why we're talking about dogma today, because it gets in the way of professional evolution. Let's start off by defining it, and then we'll see where today goes. So, in terms of definitions of dogma, of course, there's a variety of them, but the one that I have pulled up here in front of me is a principle or a set of principles that are laid down by an authority as incontrovertibly true. And I think that the important word there is the word that's really hard to say, apparently, incontrovertibly, right? Which is, don't ask any questions. This is just the way that it is. When it comes to, sorry, my phone's blowing up right now. When it comes to the fitness industry, yourself, Rye, where do you see or have you seen lately dogma pop up or dogmatic, like rigid beliefs?
Yeah. I think it's prevalent everywhere. You know, as you had mentioned, certainly exists within the fitness space and absolutely outside of it. Something I thought of actually when you were reading that definition, you know, we talk about, especially as people who are educators in this space, and I know the term, you know, science-based practitioner, evidence-based practitioner, I think it's thrown around a little bit without consideration for what that actually means.
I totally
There's
agree.
a really important concept in science, which is that a theory or a hypothesis has to be falsifiable. So dogma is inherently non-scientific because, as you had said, you know, it refutes challenge. Therefore, it refutes being falsified. So even things that are truth, you should be able to run some kind of experiment under conditions that, you know, cause like a null result or a negative result. If things are not able to be challenged, they're inherently non-scientific, which to me makes me not terribly interested in them.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically within the fitness industry, I mean, I think we could probably talk this whole podcast about different, you know, dogmatic beliefs that we've been exposed to. One that I've seen very recently and seems to be very prevalent online, I was just mentioning this before we got on air, is kind of this science-based versus, you know, anti-optimal conversation. I don't even entirely know how to define it.
Sorry, Ryan, I need you to pause. Someone's at my door and they keep calling me. I'm just going
no
to
worries.
leave it running, and then
we'll
I'm gonna edit this. I'm really sorry. I've been declining calls for the last 10 seconds.
No
and
worries.
I keep on once.
A few moments later.
And we're back. Sorry for the interruption, everybody. I had a very complicated delivery at the home office. So prior to us being interrupted by the delivery, Ryan, you were talking about the optimal, anti-optimal crowd, scientific thinking, etc. So why don't you take us away, and hopefully we won't be interrupted again.
Yeah, so I think that this is where some dogma has presented itself sort of in a more like recent form in the fitness industry. So for people that are maybe not quite as aware, especially in like the bodybuilding community, but I think fitness in general, there's been a lot of quote unquote bro science that has existed, some of which is actually quite valuable, something we could maybe talk about as well. But there have been a variety of, science based educators or coaches, trainers, etc., that have come into the space maybe in the last 10, 15 years. Namely, people like Joe Bennett, Kasim Hansen, recently like Ben Yanes, Brad Schoenfeld, etc. And especially with the study of biomechanics becoming more and more prominent, you're seeing that being integrated into training decisions more and more. So this is something like, I think I speak for both of us when I say that's a development that I think has been net positive for the industry.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think what has happened is you get a handful of people who take some of those concepts, co-opt them a little bit, and now it's manifested itself in this way where there's these bastardized, quote unquote, optimal exercises, which I'll touch on why it's in quotes in a second, where you get like a 17-year-old kid with a cuff around his bicep and a daisy chain wrapped around his head, using the whole stack, just like adducting his arm.
For sure.
And understandably, those videos then, get criticized, and it's kind of become this divide of the, optimal, anti-optimal, etc. And the problem is both of these camps are essentially dogmatic.
Mm-hmm.
Neither of them are applying good critical thinking skills. So the difficulty here lies in, and I think this is part of human behavior, is people inherently want to feel like they're a part of a group. People seek belonging. So we had talked about this off air, but I think people will see an idea that they agree with, they become attached to it. And as that idea starts to evolve and potentially evolve in ways that aren't very good, people get more and more brought in. They come also with their own set of beliefs. And there's this concept called, I believe it's called packaged beliefs. So you might share one single belief with a group of people, but there starts to become some consistency of shared beliefs between all those people. And then you create a group. And then if you differ in any of those beliefs from anyone within that group, you get exiled.
Mm-hmm.
And because people don't want to be exiled from whatever their social group is, they become more and more, quite honestly, like indoctrinated into those belief structures.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I'm sure we can see where this applies in other areas, but you see this a lot in the fitness space.
Mm-hmm.
So now you're getting, I've actually seen this with guys like Kasim, Ben Yanes as well, has posted recently. Now taking some of those videos of the daisy chain cuff people and saying, look, like this isn't actually science-based training. These people aren't applying critical thinking skills. They're not testing, retesting. They've packaged a concept. And quite honestly, with the way that algorithms work on social media, unfortunately, I think makes dogmatic beliefs grow kind of like wildfire, because rage bait works. Exactly. Rage bait works really well on social media. You got a bunch of comments, a bunch of shares. The algorithm pumps more of this stuff out. You get more people do it. And then you end up in this position where all of that nuance has become completely evaporated from the discussion. And ultimately, I think that there's good conversation to be had within, it could be that particular idea. It could be a variety of others as well. But by and large, I think this is the issue that we run into is something starts off as potentially a good idea that's applicable to a certain subgroup of people. And then that concept takes on a life of its own.
Yeah.
And then it starts gathering traction. You start getting this in-group, out-group thing. And we're no longer discussing ideas. We're discussing social dynamics at that point.
Yeah, and I think like to come back, there's a few different things that you mentioned that I think would be really important to circle back to, even just defining what is science. Because even people talk about, how, I am science-based or these people are science-based, et cetera. And I think it's important to define like, what does that word science mean? You also mentioned the word optimal, which I think you had mentioned that you yourself wanted to circle back to. And so circle back we shall. But if we think about even like the definition of science, which I pulled up here, is defined as being like the systematic study of the structured behavior of the physical and natural world through observation, experimentation, and then the testing of theories against the evidence obtained, right? And so science isn't one thing. Like science isn't one, how would I say, like a fixed set of beliefs. Like the scientific method is a word that is used to describe a method that we use to acquire and filter and perhaps organize information. It isn't one thing, but rather it's the description of a method, right? And I think that like even like people will say like this, I am science-based or what have you, and so therefore the science-based people need to tend to talk about the same things. But in reality, like there's so much more nuance there, because it isn't a rigid set of beliefs. You can have scientific discussions about anything, so long as we're doing the best we can to think critically, think analytically about given situations, about the data that we receive, and then try to do the best that we can to approximate the truth. And it's unfortunate because it almost seems like in the fitness industry, the term, science-based, evidence-based, et cetera, has like sometimes gotten like weaponized a little bit, like the science-based lifters kind of being positioned against the anti-science-based lifters, when in reality, both groups are actually practicing their own kind of version of the scientific method. It just kind of looks differently, and one group has maybe internalized it as being a part of their identity and the other hasn't. What are your thoughts on all that?
Yeah, I think something that you said there is worth, we use the phrase double click on a lot, but I think it's worth printing out and putting on a giant billboard for people, is science is not a belief structure. And that's like a really, really important concept. It sounds simple, but it's, I think, critical to understanding conversations around science.
Mm-hmm.
All science really does is science, as you said, is this method. You could either use the phrase of trying to acquire truth. I actually like using the definition of trying to become less wrong about things.
Yeah.
Our goal is to get closer and closer to the understanding of how things work.
Mm-hmm.
And we do so. This is why, again, like it's an important idea within science that things need to be falsifiable. What you're trying to do is falsify findings. Mm-hmm. You're actually trying to constantly prove things wrong to narrow down the possible explanations for a particular mechanism or
100%.
whatever it happens to be. There's, when you're talking about the scientific method, this is something I think if people were interested in actually flexing their critical thinking skills, a word that I think that is really useful is epistemology. Mm-hmm. So the scientific method is an epistemology. So all an epistemology is essentially a method used to determine truth, to collect findings, to essentially determine your opinion on something. Scientific method is by far the most consistent, reliable epistemology that we have as a species. Mm-hmm. This computer that I'm talking to you on, these the mics, the headphones, all of that comes from the scientific method.
There's no microphone. There's no microphone, Ryan. You're not using a microphone, right? We need to get you a microphone.
Fair. My microphone's actually my USB webcam right now.
That's right.
For anybody that doesn't know, I've had microphones have been the bane of my existence on this podcast. But
you've been the bane of their existence, actually.
Touche. But yeah, so I think that that's something that's really important to understand is all we're talking about here is using methods to be less wrong or to be more correct about particular subject matter. Mm-hmm. And I think this is where, again, there's this conflict between human nature, our expectations, and then what actually happens in science is people inherently believe, and sometimes this is true, there becomes this emotional tie to certain opinions. Yeah. And those opinions become completely, integrated into somebody's personality, into their identity. So now when you challenge those beliefs, people feel like you're challenging them. Mm-hmm. And then you end up in this highly reactive debate that is quite honestly probably not productive. Mm-hmm. I think that civil discourse is predicated on the idea that we dissociate our opinions from our identity so that we can tackle those opinions and discussions around them in a way that is actually pragmatic, that is objective. And if there is some room for objectivity, we can discuss, nuance within that space. But what ends up happening is, not only do you get individuals, but you get groups that their identity is tied to these certain beliefs, right? And they become very entrenched in them, and it becomes very difficult to break through. Mm-hmm. I'm of the belief, and I, kind of share this across most of my beliefs about life. I think that education solves a lot. So it could be, being educated on what exactly are the base components of exercise mechanics, understanding anatomy and physiology. It could even be do some research on like Socratic method. Like, do you actually have a way in which you can objectively and critically think through problems? But I think that we solve these issues and then we also open up the floor to actually have productive civil discourse through education.
Yeah. Yeah. And I really think it's really unfortunate. You had mentioned when folks take an idea and they kind of integrate it as being a part of their sense of self. And so then fundamentally, when an idea is challenged, people will feel challenged. And I think that that's really unfortunate because it ultimately, in my opinion, it seems like that hinders progress, not only for individuals, but hinders progress for industries. And like, I'll use an example that for me is just really fresh in my mind because of the reel I posted today. And then also because I posted it, Adam Meekins popped up on my feed, and him and the functional patterns guys are going at it again. And it's interesting because like a lot of people make fun of functional patterns, and like if for folks that don't know what that is, just go look it up. And people generally will, how would I say, even if they don't know of the history associated with functional patterns and their founder Naudi Aguilar, sometimes people will make fun because it looks a little goofy. I would say, especially at first glance, it can look goofy because they're like twisting and contorting and pushing, and they're doing all these non-traditional things. And unfortunately, I find that it happens quite often. Folks who are anti-functional patterns, they throw functional patterns out like as if it's a useless way to train. And there's a question that I try to ask myself, and that I encourage all of my students and trainers who have done mentorship with me as well. And I believe you and I have chatted about this in the past, which is like unfortunately that people tend to ask themselves, is this methodology or this exercise or whatever true or good, etc. So it tends to be kind of a binary question, like good, bad, in contrast to asking themselves, where does it fit, or when might I use it? And I love that question just so much more because there's a presupposition embedded into that question, which is that it is useful. The question is just, when is it useful and where might you use it? And like, I think of, I think of like, I look at the stuff that the functional patterns guys do and I'm like, yeah, that looks from a coordination perspective, from a balance perspective, that looks difficult. Like truly, if you like saw this weird thing where Naudi was like, he did a thing, he like twisted, he flipped, he side bend, and then he pushed this weight overhead, and it looks funny, but also I do think that could be useful with certain people that have certain goals at specific points in their progression. And I think that being able to ask ourselves, when does something fit, in contrast to just does it fit, yes or no, is a fundamentally, how would I say, it's a better question because it opens us up, to greater training opportunities and options down the road. And if you have more options, you can tackle a greater volume of challenges and goals, and you can be a little bit more nimble and agile as a fitness professional. And it saddens me, and I really wish that people would be able to engage in discourse, to be able to say, okay, when might we use this, and when might this thing that I'm teaching not be appropriate for somebody, and then also on the flip side, when is it exactly what somebody needs, and being able to have that, like you were saying, it requires that people don't identify and feel threatened when a given set of beliefs gets challenged.
Yeah, something you said that I really liked kind of at the beginning there, the question that you asked of, like, I believe it was, where does this fit or when does this fit?
Yeah, exactly.
The question that I use is this useful? And it's the same type of question. This might seem like a silly analogy, but I had a call with a client yesterday, and we're talking about creating structure as a means of essentially like reducing almost like executive decision-making fatigue. So by creating these structures that you can depend on, I forget who said it, the phrase of like, we fail at the level of our systems, which is one that I really like.
James Clear. Yeah, we don't rise to the level of our expectations. We fall to the level of our systems. Yeah.
So in his case, it was a way of juggling very busy life, like personal life, very busy work life, training, eating, etc., and creating structures and systems as a means of reducing the stress that he'd feel. And then you could just depend on that system. And it's not because the system's perfect. And I think that's an important thing to understand.
Yeah, that's important.
And all the system has to do is be useful. It doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be useful. So I think of, I can struggle with focus quite a bit as well. So even things I've got on this, I don't know if we talked about it in the podcast, but we have talked about it in person. I've gone on this kick of like cleaning the shit out of my house because I'm not a particularly tidy person. Neither is my partner. The house can be chaotic at times. And I was like, I hate this. And what ends up happening is because my house is cluttered, my brain feels cluttered. I don't know where things go because everything's messy. So I have essentially been like deep cleaning my house as a means of essentially like I'm establishing what my baseline is. So it's like, this is what clean is. So it's okay if a thing goes a day or two, because now it's like, but there's a system where then this gets tidied, I do it at this time, and now it's back to baseline. It's a completely made up thing.
Mm-hmm.
I have made it up for myself, but I've like created rules of how I'm going to manage the house staying clean. And you can apply this to anything.
Yeah.
And I think the idea is, again, like these systems don't have to be perfect. They don't even, like, they're all made up. Language is made up.
Mm-hmm.
Car designs are made up. Like all of this is made up. Politics are made up. But these systems are useful, or they can be useful. And it's finding the places where they serve utility in a way more so than they potentially restrict nuance and growth, etc.
Mm-hmm.
I had another point I wanted, but I kind of went on a bit of a tangent there.
No, it's all good. But I mean, just like to your point, this very much applies. Like how would I say, my version of what you just described with the house cleaning has to do with meal prep and just having there being consistency with lunches in particular, like breakfast and lunch are taken care of. And they're essentially the same thing every week. Drives it, honestly, my wife finds it really fascinating because she was like, you've had your chicken shawarma bowl for 5 weeks in a row. And I'm like, yeah, it's fine, tastes delicious. I rotates from sometimes it's roasted broccoli and sometimes it's like steamed green beans. Don't care, like it works for me. And that of course it may not be the best thing to eat. Like if I was to get blood work done and got, I don't know, team of dietitians to create a perfect lunch. If we think
Your
about
blood work's just going to come back and say garlic.
Yeah, exactly. Biryani, which I mean, I know it's two very different types of cuisine, but I also eat biryanis often. But to your point of like, just is it useful, right? It's simple to make. It meets my needs of protein, carbohydrates. It's easy to add in veg. I like it. It checks all of the boxes.
Something I wanted to add as well. I think we're talking a lot. I think we both recognize, there is a utility in creating, we're talking systems here, but, sometimes having those catchy one-line phrases like no pain, no gain. That's the first thing that popped into my head. Of course, that needs to be open to interpretation. But there's some usefulness that somebody can derive from that statement. And I think we've talked about this within the context of, educating trainers. You get a brand new trainer who knows nothing. Like they think the bicep connects to their hip. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
You need to give them some concrete rules.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not because those rules are absolute truth, but it's because they're useful to start to cultivate a degree of understanding.
Mm-hmm.
And as they evolve, so too do those systems. And they become less and less rigid as they start to have a deeper understanding of whatever the particular subject matter is. I think you see that in any subject. So, I think we've been talking a little bit about, we've talked about the scientific method, epistemologies, things people can do to maybe hopefully equip themselves to, have an antidote to some of this dogmatic belief camp stuff. The other thing that I think of, because there are multiple players here, individuals who get caught up in dogmatic thinking and get kind of sucked into belief camps. I think you've got a little bit of ownership as an individual to educate yourself in the ways that you can. But I have a little bit more sympathy or a little bit more empathy for those people because we've all been there. I'll even say specifically around the fitness industry. I remember the first RTS course that I took because I was deeply entrenched in powerlifting, barbell type training. And I remember being like, to the degree that I could feel my my blood pressure going up. Yeah. I was like angry that you were challenging like the barbells were not the be all end all. I was like, fuck this guy. He's skinny. I hate him. And then obviously I was wrong. Like I was incorrect. And once I like loosened up and removed myself emotionally from that situation, it allowed me to have a better understanding of what we were talking about. But that brings me to when we are talking about educators, or just I'll say authorities, they have a responsibility for how they communicate. Mm-hmm. And this is herein, I think, lies the problem, especially with social media these days. We talked about rage bait. From strictly an attention standpoint, rage bait is so useful. I hate it, but it gets a lot of eyeballs. It gets the algorithm. You get more followers. You get more business, whatever it happens to be. There's a monetary
incentive
to perpetuate, and I would actually say weaponize human behavior and weaponize the fact that people want to be a part of belief camps. And life is a lot easier when you have really rigid thinking because things fit very neatly into certain boxes, whether that's real or not, like a real representation of the world or not. So I think, they could be course providers, they could be coaches, they could be Men's Health magazine, whatever it happened to be. Anybody who's an authority in this space, I believe, has a responsibility to at least be careful and certainly not actively try to stoke those flames to elicit these, emotions to try to drive a wedge between people, because they make money doing that.
No doubt.
I think personally, I will hang my hat on this statement. I think it's completely unethical. And I think there's an onus, hopefully, I know we've talked about this at length. I think hopefully as an organization, however small we might be, that is something that we continue to lead with. We've talked about a lot, certainly in private, not only about not just giving concrete answers to people, but also not infighting with other educators in our space, like trying to have a more collaborative, more open-minded, nuanced approach to the fitness education space.
Yeah, totally. I have a lot of thoughts on this, but I think in summary, one of the things that you mentioned at the beginning, which is that like at the beginning of a career, whether it be in the fitness industry or not, unchecked nuance is really hard to it ends up just causing people to freeze. It's too much. Like they haven't gotten in enough reps, generally speaking, at the beginning of a career to be able to handle nuance. And so to your point, or to one of your earlier points, having rigid systems at the beginning or at certain points in someone's professional progression are useful, arguably needed, and that's totally fine. And we even like in some of our courses, we do get a little bit prescriptive with things, and those are preceded by a statement, which is that we are going to be giving you tools. They're going to help you with X, Y, Z, and these are not the be all end all, and these will eventually not work for certain people. And the reason why we do this is that this is one thing that I truly think would, if every single course provider preceded absolute statements with a statement that aims to shed light on the reality of things, that it's like, this is useful in certain contexts. We're giving it to you because we find it useful and it's going to empower you. And there are limits to this system, and that you will eventually outgrow it. And that's fine. It doesn't mean that this isn't useful. It's just that it just means that you're at the limit, and that's fine. And I think that like if more educational providers inserted either that kind of statement into their courses, that would promote far more critical thinking and a comfort with nuance for fitness professionals. And the other piece that I want to say, just kind of associated to that, is that and then even if they chose to not say that, The reason why, for me, very much like you, why I think it's unethical and just unexcusable when intelligent people, especially practitioners, don't actively sow seeds of nuance in the minds of their students. The reason why it's unacceptable is that it's so easy. You literally just need to use the word if, can, may in your statements. That's all you need to do. Instead of saying this will, you say this may, or this could, this should, this has the potential. Because you can say more open-ended statements. You can say them with confidence. Like confidence and ambiguity are not in conflict with each other. They're not mutually exclusive. They can coexist, which is why it very much just drives me nuts as a continuing education provider when I see other providers who I know are not dumb use language that is absolute and reductionist as a means of just gaining social traction and fundamentally leading people astray.
Yeah, I think something I think of when you talk about that, I agree with you completely, which is no surprise. I think when we look at, providers, or I'll just say authorities in general, but they don't have to be education providers. When you look at authorities that make those statements, I don't believe that most people are malicious in their intent. There's always going to be bad players, and that's just, law of averages. But I think that most people don't have malicious intent. But I think I'm hypothesizing this, but I think you get people who either even if they're really well educated, and I would almost say probably more so when they're well educated, because the more you know about something, the more you know you don't know. And I think that imposter syndrome is so prevalent amongst educated communities.
Yeah.
By that, with the fact that I think that there's this belief, certainly within our space, that it is a zero-sum game. So if I make a statement that comes across unauthoritative, comes across like I'm unsure what I'm saying, well, this person is going to leave me and spend their money over here and this person who says things with more conviction. And that could be completely made up. And maybe that does happen here and there. But I think you end up in this situation where people who are probably otherwise well-meaning people start to, exhibit this type of behavior because I think they're trying to protect their own butt from a financial standpoint, and maybe even their own ego a little bit, because they don't want people to perceive them as not being an authority in this space when they've hung their hat on it.
For sure.
There are people who are immensely more educated than I am. So I'm constantly faced with the fact, I'm like, no, I have literal evidence there's people that know more than me. And I forget sometimes, I'm like, oh, right, I've been in this industry for 13 years. I know a few things. And I will, at times will be like, why the heck is anybody paying money to work with me? I don't know anything. And then I'll have a conversation with somebody who actually knows nothing. I'm like, oh, I know a lot more than this guy. But I can understand why, just as a human being, it can be very easy to fall into this pattern of, as you said, making these absolutist statements. And then again, I feel like I keep blaming social media, but I don't think it's a small conversation. But you start making those statements. I'm sure you've gotten this advice before. It's like, make your reels punchy, make it like 15 seconds, because that's like all people's attention span. Pardon my French, how in actual fuck do you say anything with any meaningful nuance in 10 to 15 seconds? You can't.
Mm-hmm.
But then unfortunately, that little snippet that's punchy and rage baity gets all this attention, and then it perpetuates this behavior because you get this positive feedback loop. And then I think you end up with people who probably got into the industry who just were like big nerds that really cared, and they wanted to teach other people, that now have almost dug themselves into this hole that they can't get out of, where that's like part of their business model. And it's very hard to undo, I think.
Yeah, I don't know. I think for me, what feels true to me is that, I think it boils down to your values. Like, what do you value more? Like, do you value traction or being integrity with your values? Understanding that to be in integrity is a subjective thing and it depends person to person. And from my understanding, it could be defined as being like to be in integrity is to be integral with oneself, in contrast to be in fundamental conflict, where like I believe this, but I do this. And so, for me, if we think of like my personal and then also by extension professional values that are a central theme of the exercise mechanic, is this like pursuit, like the pursuit of mastery, the accumulation of nuance, the approximation of understanding something, but also accepting that you're likely never going to get there, and that's totally okay. So it's not actually ever about reaching a point of stasis of understanding something, but it's about being committed to the relentless process of being willing to refine and beat at your craft and examine, And like that's something that for me is central to my belief system, and also by extension the exercise mechanics, which is one of the reasons why you and I vibe together so much. And it's also why it is something that we will never do, because I just feel too yucky doing it. And it's like it's a hard line. And so my guess is that there's, the folks who fall to that or succumb to that, it likely has to do with belief systems and values, I think, or that they frame things in a different way. Like I've spoken with people in the past who are like, yeah, I know that that's true, but for you to help people, you need eyeballs on your content. And the way to get eyeballs is to be inflammatory. And so you need to be inflammatory initially, and then you get the chance to work with them. But like if you do, and this is actually to name a specific organization, Move You, who is far less common now. I don't know if you recall who Move You is, but I don't know if this was maybe 6 or so years ago, they were huge. They exploded, and they were making really funny content, inflammatory content, and there was conflict within the organization that led to one of their key people or two of their key people leaving and starting their own thing. And where was I going with this? Right. And the reason why they left was because of this conflict of values, of like, no, like this is not true. And so there was this conflict. And I also listened to the person who was still leading Move You at the time, and I believe he still is, talk about how, this understanding that some of the stuff that is outward facing on social media, specifically Instagram, TikTok, is inflammatory and reductionist, and it isn't as true as they claim it to be. And that when someone comes into their ecosystem, then they talk about nuance. But the thing that's nuts that these people are not acknowledging is this thing called conversion rates. You think of like the fraction of the people that follow those organizations that actually end up having the means and then also choosing to invest in their products is like probably in the vicinity of 1%, 2%. If we give them the benefit of the doubt that their conversion rates are insane, let's say 5% of their total followers invest, which is definitely not the case. That means best case scenario, 95% of their followers are being misled, when in reality, probably more accurately, we're closer to the 97 or 98. And this is why, like for me, the people that make those arguments, I'm like, no, like that's just like, sure, like I hear you. And if you zoom out, this argument that you're using to justify the process that you're going through, I think is unethical because of those ratios.
Yeah, I agree completely. And on a much smaller scale, I recently had a conversation with a friend of mine who is a young coach, very bright guy. And we're discussing, kind of the challenges of self-employment, which I'm sure you also have experienced. And I think that's just the reality. I don't think that ever goes away. And one of the things we were talking about was essentially having the luxury of having a safety net. And I can't recall exactly the beginning of the conversation, but one of the things that I had mentioned, especially in this industry, is increasingly saturated, especially online. So it can be difficult sometimes to maybe find your voice, find your audience. That it's a challenge unless you get really lucky and some viral video pops off or something like that. So his content is very informative. I actually love it. Doesn't have a particularly large following, but to your point, even with a small following, his conversion rate is actually quite good. And one of the things that I had said to him was like, look, like, I can understand the frustrations of this growing slowly. However, you're at least lucky to be in a position where you haven't had to stress about putting food on the table, which means you've been able to make decisions that feel right to you, not I have to pay a bill
100%.
in 2 weeks.
Yeah, for sure.
And I would love to say that no matter what, people would always do the right thing regardless of their financial situation. But the reality is people will and probably should, to a certain degree, prioritize paying their mortgage, putting food on the table for their kids. I can understand how people get into those situations. I'm not saying that I agree with them, but I think that at the end of the day, it sounds funny to say this, and I contemplate this often. As much as our businesses are marketed online and through social media, aside from that, like, social media is fake. It's not the real world. And I think that there can sometimes be a lot of power in taking a step back from that sometimes and realizing, like, the world is the people that you interact with, the animals that you cuddle and stuff, like all of that. That's the real world. I have 3 cats at home, so clearly I think about cuddling my cats. But, like, those are the things that bring you joy. Those are the things that are real life. And what you don't want to do, or at least I would say what I wouldn't want to do, is lose myself in trying to find this validation from, potentially thousands of people that have no idea who I am, that I'll never interact with. And I think that there's, people get a dopamine hit from this, right? I think people have talked about this a lot. You get a like or a comment or people reshare. It feels good. You feel like you did something right. And once again, I think that can be enticing to continue to follow that path. And I think if people who are maybe young in this industry just have this reminder in the back of the head that, like, one day we could snap our fingers and Meta's gone. There's no Instagram, there's no Facebook. So ultimately what matters is, like, what are the relationships with the people that you have in your life? How do you treat strangers? All of that stuff. So if what you do online closely mimics that as much as possible, and you're still able to, make a living and have a business, to me, that is kind of the best of both worlds, as opposed to getting caught up in this, algorithm rage bait game as a means of just getting more followers. To what end, right?
Yeah. And I think to build on what you were saying, to acknowledge that we are on the receiving end of that, like, we are the target of various individuals and companies who have, like, a financial stake in weaponized attention, and being able to see content for what it is, like, this is intentionally inflammatory or vice versa, is important. And I would encourage people, as we start to get towards the tail end of today, to reflect on, like, what kind of person are you, and what kind of people do you want to be surrounded by? And because, like, I know for me, like, there's a lot of, how would I say, accounts that make this type of content that I've stopped following, either intermittently or just, how would I say, absolutely, just kind of, like, cut them out of my life, because I found that their kind of consistent influence in my life was net negative. And kind of being able to acknowledge, like, the way that they speak and the values they are imparting on people are not values that I want to internalize, and thus I'm going to kind of remove this from my environment, which is why, like, my Instagram is literally just like, my search bar. It's funny. You click on it, or discovery feed, it's like mountains and dogs. And then, like, the occasional fitness video that's on my personal page. On the Exercise Mechanic, it's just fitness content. It's kind of funny. But I think that that's an important thing to remember as well. And that can kind of help, at least for me, it's been helpful in being able to navigate the online space, and thus then to curate the information that I'm exposed to.
Yeah, I love what you said there. And I'll kind of use that to, I guess, maybe wrap up my thoughts. Because, we talked about, Dogma was kind of the original prompt for this conversation. But I think that conversation is so relevant to the social media conversation as well. I think that they are so intimately intertwined. There's a concept that a friend of mine, I'm very thankful, introduced me to this idea of dopamine detoxing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm certainly not I'm not going full bore on it. I'm not just living in the woods staring at trees, but something as simple, almost like tricking your algorithm. Because I was finding a lot of the social unrest that's going on in the world, I've stayed very up to date with probably for the last year or so. And I was noticing the negative effect that was having on me emotionally quite significantly. And one of the things that I have done is, as you had said, because my feed would just be doom scroll, doom scroll, doom scroll. And I was making a point of it, skip past them. And I would click and share like cat videos, or click and share baseball videos.
Yeah.
And slowly my
Same
algorithm
thing.
has become sports and cats and like movie stuff, things that I really enjoy.
Yeah.
That I want to consume, that I would sit down and spend a while looking at or reading about, whatever. So I'm not just being exposed to kind of this negative content. The reason why I bring that up is I think if we want to equip ourselves to resist some of that dogma that can be really easy to fall into, I think consciously choosing what you consume is a really big part of that. If you're constantly looking at really inflammatory content, it is designed to stoke these emotions in you. It's designed to fire you up. And it's understandable why people then fall into these belief camps. I think if you can start to choose the content that you consume a little bit more consciously, I think that helps in a way sort of insulate you from almost accidentally being convinced of things. It forces you to sit down, make conscious choices, read something, not just be blasted with 15 seconds of some rage bait. And I think, it's obviously not going to solve it because humans are humans, but I think at the very least, it gives people some breathing room to take a step back and be like, okay, what am I actually reading here? Do I agree with this? Where are some flaws in whatever this idea is that's been presented to me? So I guess I kind of leave with this idea of, if you want to be somebody who maybe tries to remove themselves from some of these dogmatic chains, I think it extends to also how you go about the world consuming content to a certain degree, and maybe making conscious choices of what you're exposing yourself to. For me, a big thing is like picking times during the day where I don't look at my phone, which is really difficult when your business is basically through your phone. Just kind of like curating your feed and whatever else in a way that's just not going to drive this like emotional response all the time with everything that you're reading.
Yeah, totally. To build on what you just said there, I would encourage our listeners to reflect on, do you want to be right or do you want to get better? Of course, I think that generally speaking, we want both, but which one will you allow to kind of dictate the decisions you make in your life? Is it because your sense of self is so fragile that it is tied to being right? Or do you value your ability to learn and grow and evolve and approximate truth? On that note, we will wrap up there today. Ryan, thank you so much for your time. I apologize for the what felt like half an hour interruption when I got boxes delivered. And to the listeners, hopefully it's not too jarring once the editing is complete. I'll do my best to smooth this out. If you found today interesting or informative, please like, share, and subscribe, and share it with your fellow human beings, fitness professionals, etc. And we will see you on the next podcast episode. Bye for now.